The dry summer heat beat down mercilessly as Faith Jenkins stood outside the Lucky Chance Saloon, one hand supporting her aching back, the other resting protectively over her swollen belly. 7 months pregnant and alone in Ventura, Colorado, she had nowhere left to run. The year was 1879, and the western frontier offered little mercy to a woman in her condition, especially one with no husband and no family name to protect her. Faith's cotton dress clung to her skin as sweat trickled down her neck, her eyes scanning the dusty Main Street for the 100th time that afternoon. The sound of raucous laughter and piano music spilled from the saloon doors behind her, a stark contrast to the hollow ache in her chest. 3 days she'd been waiting, hoping to find work as a cook or laundress, anything to earn enough money for a room and food. But no one in Ventura seemed eager to hire a pregnant woman with mysterious origins. Faith closed her eyes against the setting sun, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here. "Madam, you've been standing here since noon." The deep voice startled her, and she turned to face a tall man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes. "If you don't mind me saying, that's no condition to be out in this heat." Thomas Keller adjusted his worn cowboy hat, pushing it back slightly to better see her face. He'd noticed her each time he'd passed by today. A pregnant woman waiting outside a saloon was hardly a common sight in Ventura, and there was something about her quiet dignity that tugged at him. "I'm waiting for the owner," Faith lied, not wanting to admit she had nowhere else to go. "I'm seeking employment." Thomas studied her face for a moment, noting the exhaustion in her blue eyes and the proud tilt of her chin despite her circumstances. He'd seen plenty of desperate people in his years as a rancher, but something about this woman's situation stirred something protective in him. "Jake Harper doesn't hire women in your condition," he said gently, "and you look ready to collapse." He removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair with streaks of sun-bleached brown. "I'm Thomas Keller. I own the Double K Ranch just outside town." Faith hesitated, wary of strange men after everything she'd been through. "Faith Jenkins," she finally replied. "And I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Keller." "No charity offered, madam, just humanity." Thomas extended his arm toward her. "Let's go home. I've got a spare room in my house where you can rest, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, would appreciate the company." Faith stared at his offered arm, suspicion warring with desperation. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because my mother taught me never to turn away someone in need," he answered simply. "And because I've been alone enough to know sometimes all a person needs is a helping hand." Something in his honest gaze made Faith's defenses crumble. She'd been running for so long, and her baby would arrive soon. With trembling fingers, she placed her hand on his arm. "Just until I find work," she said firmly. Thomas nodded, relieved she'd accepted. "Just until then." The Double K Ranch sprawled across 500 acres of Colorado wilderness, with mountains framing the horizon and a creek cutting through the eastern pastures. As Thomas guided his wagon up the long drive, Faith took in the 2-story farmhouse with its wide porch and the collection of outbuildings that marked a prosperous operation. "It's not much," Thomas said, misreading her silence for disappointment, "but it's peaceful." "It's beautiful," Faith corrected him softly. After months of sleeping wherever she could find shelter, the sight of the solid house with smoke curling from its chimney seemed like a mirage. A stout woman with silver-streaked hair hurried from the house as they approached. "Thomas Keller." "You're late for supper, and I was about to—" Her words halted when she spotted Faith. "Oh, we have a guest, Mrs. Winters. This is Miss Faith Jenkins," Thomas said as he helped Faith down from the wagon. "She'll be staying in the spare room for a while. Mrs. Winters' eyes softened as she noticed Faith's condition. Well then, you must be famished, dear. Come inside before you both wither in this heat. The interior of the house surprised Faith with its warmth and comfort. While not lavish, it was well furnished with solid wooden pieces and colorful quilts that gave it a homey feel. The kitchen smelled of freshly baked bread and stew, making Faith's stomach growl loudly enough for Thomas to hear. "When did you last eat?" he asked, frowning. Faith hesitated. "Yesterday morning." Mrs. Winters clicked her tongue disapprovingly and immediately set about filling a bowl with fragrant beef stew. "Sit down, child. No one starves under my watch, especially not one feeding two." As Faith ate, Thomas explained how he'd found her. Mrs. Winters nodded sagely, as though taking in pregnant strangers was perfectly normal behavior for her employer. "The blue room is already made up," she told Faith. "It has its own washstand and a view of the garden. After supper, I'll draw you a bath." Faith's eyes welled with unexpected tears. "I can work for my keep," she insisted. "I'm an excellent cook and I can sew," and Thomas raised a hand to stop her. "There'll be time for that discussion tomorrow. Tonight you rest." Later, soaking in the first hot bath she'd had in months, Faith allowed herself to cry silently. She didn't know what Thomas Keller's ultimate intentions were, but for tonight, she was clean, fed, and safe. It was more than she'd had in a long time. Thomas sat on his porch that night, watching stars appear over his land while he sipped whiskey from a small glass. He couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious woman now sleeping under his roof. She was clearly running from something or someone, but the fear in her eyes hadn't masked her determination. Thomas respected that. At 32, he'd built his ranch from nearly nothing after returning from the war with little more than nightmares and a fierce desire for open spaces. He'd lost his wife Emma to fever 5 years ago, and while the ranch prospered, his house had remained just that, a house, not truly a home. "You're a fool, Keller," he muttered to himself. "Taking in strays will only bring trouble." Yet something about Faith Jenkins had awakened a protectiveness he thought had died with Emma. He finished his whiskey and headed to bed, telling himself this arrangement was temporary just until she found her footing. Dawn broke over the ranch with the familiar sounds of roosters crowing and cattle lowing in the distant pastures. Faith woke disoriented, momentarily panicked until she remembered where she was. The blue room, as Mrs. Winters had called it, was bathed in soft morning light. For a moment, Faith allowed herself to imagine this was her home, that she belonged somewhere safe. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Jenkins," Mrs. Winters called. "Breakfast is ready when you are. Thank you." "I'll be right down," Faith replied, quickly dressing in her cleanest dress, though clean was relative after weeks of travel. Downstairs, she found Thomas already seated at the table, studying a ledger while drinking coffee. He stood when she entered, and Faith was struck again by his height and the quiet strength he emanated. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Faith admitted, taking the seat Mrs. Winters indicated. "Thank you again for your kindness." Thomas nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with gratitude. "Mrs. Winters mentioned you know how to cook." "Yes, among other things. My father owned a hotel in St. Louis before he died. I helped in every aspect of running it." "A hotel in St. Louis?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's a long way from Ventura." Faith tensed, aware she'd revealed more than intended. "Life takes unexpected turns, Mr. Keller." "Thomas," he corrected. "And yes, it certainly does." He studied her for a moment before continuing. "Mrs. Winters has been asking for help with the household for some time. If you're interested, the position is yours until your situation changes." Faith's hand instinctively moved to her belly. "And after the baby comes?" "We'll figure that out when the time comes," Thomas said simply. I've converted one of the storage rooms into a nursery for my foreman's children when they visit. It can serve for your little one as well." Faith stared at him, bewildered by his generosity. "Why are you doing this? You don't know me." "I know enough," Thomas replied, his gaze direct. "You're alone, expecting a child and determined not to beg. That speaks to your character. The rest you can tell me when you're ready or never. It's your choice." Faith swallowed hard. "The father is not in the picture," she said softly. "And won't be." Thomas nodded, accepting this without judgment. "Then we won't speak of him unless you wish to." Over the next 2 weeks, Faith settled into life at the Double K. She helped Mrs. Winters with cooking and mending, and even took over keeping the household accounts when Thomas discovered her facility with numbers. The work was honest and satisfying, and for the first time in months, Faith slept without fear. Thomas kept a respectful distance, but Faith often caught him watching her with a curious expression. He was unfailingly kind, bringing her wildflowers he'd found while checking fence lines or carving a small wooden horse for the baby. Each gesture chipped away at the walls Faith had built around her heart. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Faith sat on the porch swing, enjoying the cool breeze. Thomas joined her, offering a glass of lemonade. "You've brought order to my chaotic household," he said, sitting beside her. "Mrs. Winters says you've reorganized the pantry in a way that makes sense for the first time in years." Faith laughed softly. "It's the least I can do. You've given me sanctuary when I needed it most." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching darkness settle over the land. Finally, Faith spoke the words she'd been holding back. "I was married," she said quietly. "His name was Edward Jenkins. He owned that hotel in St. Louis I mentioned, and I was his bookkeeper before we married. He was charming, successful, and had a terrible gambling problem I didn't discover until after our wedding." Thomas remained silent, giving her space to continue. "When I told him about the baby, he seemed happy at first, but then his debts caught up with him. He tried to sell me to one of his creditors to settle what he owed." Faith's voice broke. "When I refused, he beat me so badly I feared for the baby. I left that night with what little money I could gather." Thomas's hands gripped the arm of the swing so tightly his knuckles whitened. "Is he looking for you?" Faith nodded. "He sent men after me in Denver. That's why I kept moving west. I can't let him find me. He'll kill me for running and the baby." She shuddered. Without thinking, Thomas reached over and covered her hand with his. "He won't find you here. And if he does, he'll have to go through me first." The fierce protectiveness in his voice warmed something in Faith's chest. For the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she allowed herself to believe she might truly be safe. As her pregnancy progressed, Faith grew increasingly comfortable at the Double K. The ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her, and Mrs. Winters became both friend and surrogate mother. But it was Thomas who surprised Faith. Most he built a cradle from pine wood, carefully sanded until it gleamed, and placed it in her room without fanfare. "My father built one for each of his children," he explained when she thanked him, a faint blush coloring his tan cheeks. "Seemed right the little one should have the same." One afternoon in her 8th month, Faith was hanging laundry when she heard a commotion from the main house. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she saw a rider dismounting a stranger in an expensive suit that looked out of place in Ventura. "I'm looking for Faith Jenkins," the man announced loudly. "I have reason to believe she's here." Faith froze, her heart pounding. It wasn't Edward, but she recognized the man as Harold Simmons, one of her husband's gambling associates. Somehow they'd tracked her to Colorado. Before she could hide, Simmons spotted her. "There you are, Mrs. Jenkins. Your husband's been beside himself with worry." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Time to come home, my dear." "She is home," Thomas's voice rang out as he emerged from the barn, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground, a warning, not yet a threat. "And you're trespassing on my property." Simmons's smile faltered. "This is a family matter, sir. Mrs. Jenkins belongs with her husband." "My name is Faith," she said, finding her voice as she moved to stand beside Thomas. "And I belong where I choose. Edward forfeited any right to me when he tried to trade me like cattle." "He's a changed man," Simmons insisted, though his eyes hardened. "And that's his child you're carrying." "He has rights." "The only rights that matter here are Miss Faith's," Thomas said, his voice dangerously calm. "And she's made her choice clear. Now I suggest you get back on your horse and tell Edward Jenkins that if he or any of his associates come near her again, they won't leave my land alive." Faith felt Thomas's arm press slightly against hers, a silent promise of protection that gave her courage. Simmons assessed the situation, noting the ranch hands who had materialized around the yard, each one watching him with open hostility. "This isn't over," he warned, but mounted his horse nonetheless. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied, raising his rifle slightly. "Ventura's a small town, Mr. Simmons. Word travels fast when strangers ask questions. You won't find welcome here." After Simmons departed, Faith collapsed into Thomas's arms, trembling. "He'll come back," she whispered. "Edward won't give up." Thomas held her carefully, mindful of her belly between them. "Neither will I," he promised. "I've notified Sheriff Daniels. Edward Jenkins won't get within 10 miles of you without the whole town knowing." That night, unable to sleep, Faith heard soft footsteps outside her door and then the creak of floorboards as someone settled in the hallway. Curious, she opened her door to find Thomas sitting on a chair, rifle across his knees. "What are you doing?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Making sure you both sleep soundly," he replied simply. Faith felt tears welling in her eyes. "You can't sit there all night." "I've slept in worse conditions," Thomas said with a half-smile. "Go back to bed, Faith. I'll be here." Instead, she sat on the floor beside his chair, her back against the wall. "Then I'll keep you company for a while." In the quiet darkness of the hallway, Thomas told her about his life growing up on a small farm in Pennsylvania, fighting in the war, losing his parents to influenza, and coming west to start fresh. He spoke of Emma, the childhood sweetheart he'd married, and the fever that took her before they could start the family they'd planned. "I thought my chance at happiness died with her," he admitted softly. "The ranch became everything because it was all I had left." Faith reached up and took his hand. "And now," Thomas's fingers intertwined with hers, "now I'm starting to think maybe life gives second chances if you're brave enough to take them." The baby arrived 2 weeks later, during a summer thunderstorm that rattled windows and turned the ranch yard to mud. Mrs. Winters sent for the town midwife, but the creek had flooded, making the road impassable. Faith labored through the night with only Mrs. Winters and Thomas to help her. "You're doing beautifully," Mrs. Winters encouraged as another contraction gripped Faith. "The baby's almost here." Thomas paced outside the door, feeling helpless as Faith's cries echoed through the house. When Mrs. Winters called him in to bring more hot water, he was shocked by Faith's pallor. "Thomas," she gasped, reaching for his hand. "If something happens, nothing's happening except you bringing this child safely into the world," he interrupted firmly, squeezing her fingers. "You're the strongest person I know, Faith Jenkins. This storm doesn't stand a chance against you." His words seemed to give her renewed strength. With a final, tremendous effort, Faith brought her daughter into the world just as dawn broke through the clouds. "A girl," Mrs. Winters announced, cleaning the squalling infant. "Healthy as can be." When Thomas saw Faith holding her daughter, something shifted permanently in his heart. The baby had a shock of dark hair and her mother's determined chin, and watching them together, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that he wanted them both in his life forever. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "What will you name her?" Faith looked up at him, exhausted but radiant. "Hope," she said softly, "because that's what you gave me when you offered your arm outside that saloon." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Hope," he repeated. "It suits her." In the weeks that followed, Thomas watched in wonder as Faith blossomed into motherhood. Little Hope became the center of the ranch's attention, with even the gruffest cowboys melting at her toothless smile. Thomas found himself inventing reasons to be in the house, just to see them both. One evening, as Faith sat in the garden rocking Hope to sleep, Thomas joined her with a small package. "I have something for you," he said nervously. "For both of you, actually." Faith unwrapped the paper to find a deed for the Double K Ranch, with both their names listed as owners. "Thomas, I don't understand," she said, confused. "I love you," he blurted out, kneeling beside her chair. "I think I've loved you since I saw you standing so proudly outside that saloon. You and Hope are my family now, if you'll have me." Faith stared at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "But my past Edward could still come back." "Let him try," Thomas said fiercely. "This is your home now, our home. I want to adopt Hope as my daughter and give you both my name, but only if that's what you want too." Faith touched his face gently. "I've been falling in love with you since the moment you said, 'Let's go home,' and actually meant it," she whispered. "But are you sure? Taking on another man's child, Hope is yours, which makes her precious to me," Thomas interrupted. "And I hope someday she'll have brothers and sisters to grow up with on this land." Faith's answer was to lean forward and press her lips to their first kiss, full of promise and new beginnings. They married in the garden of the Double K 2 months later, with Hope cradled in Mrs. Winter's arms and half the town in attendance. Sheriff Daniels stood guard, but Edward Jenkins never appeared later. They would learn he'd been killed in a gambling dispute in St. Louis, forever releasing Faith from her past. Thomas formally adopted Hope, who grew up calling him Papa with such natural love that no one would have guessed he wasn't her blood father. A year after their wedding, Faith gave birth to a son they named James, after Thomas's father. 2 more children would follow Elizabeth and Michael, completing their family. Word spread through the territory about the Keller family and their prosperous ranch. Thomas expanded his holdings, but never forgot the values that mattered most. Each time a traveler came to their door in need, they were welcomed with the same kindness Thomas had once shown Faith. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas took Faith back to Ventura, now a growing town with a proper hotel and school. They stood outside the spot where the Lucky Chance Saloon had once stood, now replaced by a general store. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked, holding her close. "Taking a chance on a dusty cowboy who couldn't mind his own business?" Faith laughed, the sound as light and free as it had been since the day Hope was born. "Best decision I ever made," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "You offered your arm and promised to take me home. I just didn't realize then that home wasn't a place, it was you." As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the town that had witnessed the beginning of their story, Thomas and Faith walked arm in arm back to their waiting children. The journey hadn't always been easy, but they had built something precious together, a family founded on second chances, and the courage to believe in love again. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch lay peaceful under starlight, Faith would remember that desperate day outside the saloon. How close she had come to walking away, too proud and scared to accept help. How differently her life might have turned out if Thomas Keller hadn't offered his arm and said those simple words that changed everything. "Let's go home." In those moments, with Thomas's arms around her and their children sleeping safely nearby, Faith knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home, at last.